Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to turn things over to the, get things started with the audience. Thank you all. And just in order to help me see better, I'm going to stand at the podium here. Okay, so I have a question here, but just before we get started, in the interests of time, I have two kind of guidelines for questions. Can you please state your name and also ensure that your question has a question in it and isn't just a comment? So we have microphones, and so I think I had a hand here, and then we'll go over there. So ready? Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Nathan Hawkins. I wanted to reply both to Melody and to Paul. There we go. I've spent the last 5 years living in Montreal, and I can say definitively that infill housing can change affordability. Where I lived there in an apartment would easily cost at least 3 times as much here. And the difference is in how land in Montreal is used and managed versus Vancouver. I look at them just because I lived there for a long time and I'm more familiar with it. 70% of Montreal, or of Vancouver, is single family home zoning. In Montreal, it's 25%. So Montreal has 3 times more density. There's walk-ups everywhere. There's whole neighborhoods where you only see buildings that are at least 3 stories, and each level is housing, 3-4 bedroom rooms. There's a student ghetto, they call it the McGill ghetto, and the whole neighborhood is like that. And it's dirt cheap to live there. So I do think that seeing more infill housing will bring housing prices down, but it's because it's such a slow trickle that we haven't seen the change yet. The new houses now might cost $1.5 million, but once we double, triple, quadruple the density of Vancouver, especially in the west side, that's when we'll see the change. So my question is about the general goal in terms of Vancouver city planning, especially, again, focused on the west side. This is a bit of a hobby of mine. And I've gone through old city planning books dating back to the 1930s. And they explicitly say part of the intentional design of Vancouver, especially the West-East division, is that we want to segregate people based on socioeconomic status. Neighborhoods like Shaughnessy were intentionally designed only for the rich, and they use language like, we want to keep the poor out of our neighborhood, we want to shove them on East Vancouver. So it's obviously not spoken in that language now, but a lot of people's actions today who live in those neighborhoods are very reminiscent. They're shaped by the ideas and the goals of generations past. So how do we combat something so monolithic, so generational in the way Vancouverites are thinking about their land, their neighborhoods, their space?
Join Jen Squeeze.
You got to deal with the Jane Jacobs problem. Now, I don't know whether she actually really did say this, it was more nuanced than that, but do you believe that the people who live in a neighborhood, who comprise the community, basically are the best ones to decide on its future? You don't. That's heretical. Because there's a generation, probably, I'm going to be presumptuous here, guess most of the people in this room think that that's basically where you start. If you're going to have a planning process, you go to the community and you ask them, what do you like about your neighborhood? What is it you want to see preserved? What are the values that you hold high here? What do you think the obligation of the city is to preserve those values? And guess what? Turns out it's pretty close to what they already got. And you want to take that away? You want to impose it on them? You want the city, the heavy-handed government, to go in and say, everything that you've worked for, everything that you believe in, your identity, your status, your status, that you associate with that iconic single-family house, that garden, that neighborhood you were raised in. We're going to bulldoze it for a bunch of people, basically, who won't, well, I don't have to go any further. You get my point. So you got to deal with the Jane Jacobs problem. And I think we are. What you just said wouldn't have been said at the time I was on council. Oh, no. So whether it's YIMBY or Generation Squeeze or a new generation or people who see a new reality, that process is underway. But it won't be fast, nor should it. And it will be political, because it must be. And you can participate in that.
Okay, thank you.
My name's Michael Kluckner. I'm a longtime witness, I guess, to Vancouver, observer of Vancouver, and I'm chair of the Heritage Commission. I'm also of Paul's mother's generation, when houses were cheap but mortgage rates were 11.5% or 12%. You want to know why houses were cheap? Money was expensive. So, you know, I've never seen more apples compared with oranges than I've heard tonight. But I want to follow up a little bit on on this matter of increasing housing choices in the so-called single-family zones. I think the recent research, particularly by Andy Yan, about who is actually living in these detached housing zones is a really interesting question there. How few of them are actually single family, and how single family, the use of the term single family, is actually a word of propaganda. Detached house, fair enough. I think that's a fair description of the topology that's there. But I want to ask particularly Melody and Ouri and Paul to comment on whether they think that this evolution of housing forms, particularly into duplexes, triplexes, and townhouses, is favoring a kind of a nuclear family white professional model of Vancouver compared with the shared housing model and the ethnic multi-generational model that is using these detached houses, particularly in South Vancouver and East Vancouver. And to follow through with that, is this not a tale of two cities? Is there not the west side that has really gathered the bad publicity, but isn't South Vancouver and East Vancouver in these detached housing areas a different place altogether? Thank you.
Okay. I could start. First of all, I want to thank you for bringing to our attention the low interest rates. I think it's something that people don't talk about often, but it is a reality, and it is a reality also for young people who are buying into the market right now, that has assisted them and given them the ability to do so in part. In terms of single family homes, I wrote a whole post about how I hated the words and the term single family home. I recognize that it is in the zoning bylaw. It's written as single-family zoning, single-family homes. But growing up in Vancouver as in a working-class ethnic community, single-family homes were not single-family homes. They contained multiple families, multiple generations. You know, when we go to parties, make sure that you're quiet because there's someone in the basement suite, or don't make sure that you're quiet because grandma is sleeping. So single-family homes, when I learned about this language, I'm like, that's weird. It was never a single-family home to me growing up. I prefer single detached home and low density because now we're describing the form instead of a sociological term. I mean, who got to determine how a single family lived when it was written? Or who got to determine who constituted a family when the zoning was written? In terms of how people interact in a single-family home or a single detached home, when you have a multi-generational or even multi-family home, it's more around co-living, where you have these social collisions that happen serendipitously, that people can share a meal together over, the dinner table, that you have grandma and grandpa caring for the kids, or parents being there so that you don't have senior loneliness and you have senior care. It's a great form of living that I think that we should be inspired with, and that our zoning is only catching up with these arrangement. I recognize that people who are renting basement suites are in very precarious rental situation, and providing them different forms of housing may help with that, and providing them with different types of tenure. So I guess I'll end there in terms of single-family homes.
Two quick thoughts for me, and by the way, I just love the idea of like a witness to Vancouver. That's a lovely phrase. I'm going to think about that more myself. But to your questions, one on the interest rates, let there be no mistake. I don't do apples and orange comparisons. You better believe in 1976 there were far higher interest rates than we have today. But even at historically low interest rates today, the typical Metro Vancouverite has to devote months more of their annual earnings to cover an average mortgage than did the same age person generation ago, even when they only had to work a few years to save their down payment. So I'm happy to show you this data on that piece. But then I think you're asking like the built form, and I'm not sure that I'm at this point ready for Vancouver to concede that something that looks like a detached home, even if we start to have multiple families residing in that detached home, is a big enough vision for us going forward. And actually, one of the shortcomings of my observations tonight has been that I haven't brought up enough of the conversation of we need purpose-built rental. We're a city where the majority of people are renters. We need to be thinking about how we build more and more rental in a city where there's next to no vacancy, in a city where those dramatic high home prices are starting to really see the harm and pain come into higher and higher rents. And we need to recognize that as more and more young people and newcomers to this city, whatever their age, they're going to be renters going forward, and they still need a security. They want to think like, I'd like my kid to go to that childcare for a few years or to that school for many years. And the way we used to do that in the past was you buy in that neighborhood. That's how you got security. But that's out of reach more and more. And so then the next best option is planning for a business model that's planning for people to be long-term renters. That's what purpose-built rental does. When we build more condos that some people invest in and then rent out for a while, that's an insecure kind of rental. And that's not really where I would encourage our city to be going. And so I think our new Housing Vancouver strategy ought to be lauded for the fact that it is reimagining zoning, actually sometimes for areas that are going to be entirely rental. That's novel.
Okay.
And I think I would just add to that, if you think about the purpose-built rental versus a single detached home that might have housed many generations, I think we need to figure out how our purpose-built rentals are going to do the same thing. And I think it's important that we consider how they might do that, because we are a city of many cultures, and our many cultures really value our generations. They value being able to live together. They value being able to support together, being able to create community together. So we need to figure out how we're going to do this moving forward in our rental housing. And I think I don't think that's impossible. I think it's quite doable.
Okay, thank you. Shirley, you have a question and comment in the middle here? And then I've got one here and then one in the back. Okay. Do we have a mic?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Sergio Aquino, I have a question about the opioid crisis. It's a little closer. The opioid crisis. Mm-hmm. So, number of transplants, of kidney transplants is increasing. It's increasing in Vancouver and it's increasing in North America in general. Do you think society, not in a conscious manner, but basically it's seeing this crisis as well, the bad guys, the opioid users, addicts, don't value their bodies. It's fair that the good guys, people that don't do drugs, will use their kidneys, etc.
I mean, I have no idea about the logistics of organ donation, and that I think that's a really complex issue. But that aside, I think we are placing value on people's lives when we don't address things like the opioid crisis, when we don't address the significant levels of homelessness in the downtown east side. I think that is a value statement.
Can I just add one thought on that?
Yeah,
sure. I work at the School of Population Health at the University of BC, and it's right to describe the opioid crisis as a health issue. And we know in our school that illness, health doesn't start with medical care. Health starts where we're born, we grow, we play, we work, and we age. That means in this city, health starts in our city. And that it's not the only domain of city planners, but it certainly does mean that city planners need to be curating a conversation with our population health professionals, et cetera, and using their voice to champion the need for that health conversation at our provincial and federal levels, which I would say our city planners and our city elected officials actually do quite a lot of.
Yeah, they provide bike lanes. They provide walkable cities. This is for the betterment of your health. And that's a value thing. It's valuing your health versus somebody else's health or a certain other kind of health. There's tons of value built into that.
Okay, I have a question in the front here. Do we have a microphone? Okay, Shirley, okay?
I guess I'm up.
Yeah.
I guess I recognize this is a Vancouver Milestones, and yet we really are not able to draw a line around ourselves and acknowledge that the interest rate policies, the homelessness policies, the opioid crisis, these are not Vancouver problems and Vancouver making solely. And you know, what's resoundingly absent is the role of the federal government that has absented itself from from actively engaging in solving these problems. I mean, we had a lot of purpose-built rental housing that many of us, of my generation, 70 now, lived in and rented for many years. And, you know, the fact that if we don't solve homelessness and drug addiction and drug policies across this country, we're not going to solve it here. But it goes beyond even our borders. It goes to the international level because, you know, my friends who have money talk about, oh, there's so much liquidity these days. That's why it's being invested in housing, because it's such a great way to make money. You're not going to make it at the bank. The interest rates are too low. You know, we did buy homes when the interest rates were 20% and 18%. And it was a real struggle, and it was not an easy thing. But having senior levels of government who are willing to take leadership in solving our national problems, because that's what they are. You know, when I listen to people talking about homelessness on the streets of Vancouver, and they all come from Manitoba, or they come from Quebec, and they come from Yukon, well, there's a reason why they come here. It's a little friendlier climate. But, you know, how do you see us re-engaging senior levels of government in a way that's meaningful, in a way that will actually make a difference, in a way that will solve some of these problems for our citizens? And I guess it hits Paul, it hits Gordon. You know, I mean, Melody, of course, she sees herself as a renter. She can't even support building market condos because she says, I can only afford to rent. I mean, those are part of the problems in our city.
Well, one key thing, Shirley, no, Vancouver can't even solve the problems of the region on its own. And indeed, I think one of the changes that has occurred to Vancouver is we are no longer really the significant lone major player. And nor the housing crisis will simply not be solved in 44 square miles east of Boundary Road, west of Boundary Road. That's just not on. And indeed, much of the solution will be found beyond our borders, and hence we're into transportation issues and all those connected things. But I would go back to a point I made earlier, celebrate success. Why do you think the federal government was able to pull out so successfully in the mid-90s? Because we had never celebrated the success of that investment that we had made. I learned this in council. You're never going to get any credit. Mm-hmm. You can vote for every nonprofit housing. You can vote for everything. And the most you will get will be, it's a good first start. And then they'll focus on the failure. So Gregor Robertson makes a commitment to solve homelessness, identifies 2,000 truly homeless, I guess, no shelter, and solves that problem. And guess what? Another 2,000 showed up. But is his initiative seen as a success, at least half? No. Total failure. So to think you can go to senior governments and say, hey, give us a lot more resources. You will get no credit for this. It will be seen to be a failure regardless, but give us more. And we might say it's a good first start. So unless you change the attitude, this is political. This is political. I mean, I learned this so quickly. If you come and say, no matter what I do, you're not going to acknowledge my support, I'll go to the people who will, and they will get my support. That's the calculation.
Okay, thank you. We have a question in the front.
Thank you. Margot Sangster, and I wanted to follow up on something that Paul said, but Shirley also has segued in, and others had mentioned. So regarding the rental housing pool, I imagine one or more of you are familiar with the people who came here from Vienna in the last year to speak about their housing strategy. So they had an amazing housing strategy. Now, admittedly, it started about 100 years ago or way back when, but the point is that the city of Vienna, not all of Austria, but the city of Vienna, made a commitment to make housing a basic human right and used land that they had control over to build housing for housing the citizens of the community that lived in it. So there, what they reported, from what I recollect, is that people invested in other modalities. They weren't investing, at least in that region, in housing for a return on investment. So you've already discussed a little bit about the lack of credit that people, that different levels of political governments receives. But basically you have to, I think, pull together the academics, the politicians, the lobbyists, and the concerned citizens, and you have to collectively go after the federal, provincial, and municipal government, and you have to say, this is a crisis, and if something doesn't change, you're going to have more and more and more of the same. So somehow you have to galvanize all of the players, and all of you are excellent speakers. And so, please address that. What are you going to do?
I guess I'll address maybe one part of your question, which is, or maybe two part. What am I going to do? And two, in terms of the Vienna model, as well as building housing for citizens on public land. So I'm currently advocating on the Northeast Falls Creek neighborhood plan right now. And when the viaducts come down, if they come down, there will be 2 pieces of public land, over 4 acres, that will be available. But the city has already determined that they want to build a majority market housing and sell condos using that land, instead of using it for rentals or social housing or non-market housing. There's something really wrong with that when the city is now, no, I actually heard it from a planner's mouth. And no, it's written in the plan. It's written in
Decision that it's going to be market condos on that 4-acre.
Oh, I'm protesting it, but the majority of...
The minimum you've got to do is at least be able to defend that factual statement. Are you saying that the city of Vancouver, the council's made a decision that that 4 acres is going to be market condo? And you can defend that?
I would say a planner told me in person that, and also it's in the plan right now, it hasn't passed yet, that the majority of the housing that will be on those 4 acres is market housing, and some of them will be market condos to fund the amenities of Northeast Falls Creek, and also to fund the viaducts coming down. It's to be determined, right? But of course, I'm advocating against it.
I'm coming down on you for the same reason that I make this point about celebrating success. If the
Can you use the mic? Can you use the mic?
If the discussion is poisoned by simply, we see it all around us, this inability to determine what is true, that has become so destructive that it's now questioning the basis of democracy to be able to function in some jurisdictions.
Then why doesn't the city become more transparent? Why don't they give us the pro forma of what they're allocating those 2 pieces of land for? Why do we have to mobilize so many people to go to City Hall to protest to make sure that it's secured housing for the public?
What is your obligation?
My obligation is to speak up and stand up for what I think is right.
For what is true.
for what I think is right, because I don't have any transparency of what the spreadsheets are for Northeast Falls Creek, but it's written in the plan. So if the city wants to, they can release those spreadsheets for us and then let us know what they have plans for, because written in the plans, it says market housing, and that is irresponsible.
Just be cautious, because I think you've got a future here, and I think it'll be in politics. But minimally, you have to be able to defend particularly something like that, because it really does have consequences.
So it's clear there's some lack of clarity in the community about what the plans are.
That's fair enough to say that.
That
lack of clarity, I get that. And you can certainly call on the city for more transparency.
And I think clearly there's some concern. So we need more information and clarity. Thank you. I think we have a question right here, and I'm working my way around the room, so I'll come back to there after.
Hi, my name's Ian Mass, and I'll actually celebrate something the city did. They did it 35 years ago, which is build Champlain Heights. I've lived there for 35 years. It's a wonderful community, still owned by the city, leased out to me and many others on 99-year leases. And a great example, not particularly dense, but that was 35 years ago. Pardon? For its time, it was. Oh, yeah, it was for its time. So my question kind of comes back to the city actually has a history, Southeast Falls Creek, or South Falls Creek, Champlain Heights, of building housing, building it as a public enterprise.
Federal loans.
Pardon me?
Federal loans.
Federal loans, yes, okay. I'm getting to that because we've got. So I was slightly encouraged when VAHA, the housing authority, was conceived. Community Land Trust. There's some buildings looking like it's happening through the Co-op Association of British Columbia. One just opened, a couple of more down on the Fraser Lands, and I'm wondering. But I still don't have confidence that that's the kind of bold public enterprise thinking that we had 35 years ago. That your concern, Melody, which is, because I've read Northeast Falls Creek too, and I read the same thing into that as you read into it. Certainly, the high-rises around Yaletown aren't going to be public housing. So I'm just wondering about a comment. Sorry, I'm trying to wrap this up here. I want to comment about these kind of tentative things. Are they as tentative as they look, or do they actually have some substance if the feds and province get into it? Thanks.
Well, panelists might want to add into this, but I think it's fair to say that the city of Vancouver in the last couple of years has committed more to using public land to build housing on than any other city in the country. I don't know if I can justify that last claim, but they're doing it in bold ways. They're saying we have land available, we can partner with senior levels of government to build building on top of that land, and it's an open conversation about whether or not you can keep the land in public trust so that either it's rental or it is a different kind of ownership where it's just sort of a shared equity where the land's held in public trust and people own the building on top of it. These are innovative ways we could move forward, and I think that the current council, although it is soon to be changing, definitely has that as a part of its housing strategy going forward. I don't know how much time we'd have left. I really think that Gord has nailed something that's important. Often I feel like I have to carry the weight of this, so kind of like Gord doing it tonight. He says it differently than me, but we can't individually work our way out of the problems we face in this city right now. You can't work, put your nose to the grindstone and just work harder and figure out how to make a home in this place going forward, given what earnings are doing relative to home prices. We can't on our own solve climate change. We can't on our own address the opioid crisis. These are things that require the community to respond collectively. That means they require politics to work. But at its essence these days, and I just was looking at some trust data, Canadians have more fun thinking of our elected officials as punchlines of jokes rather than persons to respect. I'm going to say that again. We make politics and politicians punchlines of jokes, not persons and processes to respect. So long as that's the case, we will not, as a community, buy into politics being the place where we solve these big problems. And here's the rub. There is no other place where we can solve these problems, because alone we cannot do it. Only as communities we can. And politics is how communities work together. And so we all need to own some responsibility for eschewing the cynicism to which Gord was pointing earlier, and coming up with ways to tell stories at Thanksgiving dinner and other holiday dinners, and when we're having drinks with friends and coffee in the morning, like, wow, we can do good things together. Because if we don't actually remind ourselves of a 1966, here's my story to make it true. This is the Canadian story we should tell. 1966, in one single year, we implemented our Canada medical healthcare system and our Canada public pension plan. In one single year, the two programs in which we spend the most money today as citizens, we did it in one single year, and they're the things that we're often most proud of. We can do that again for things like housing, for climate change, etc.
Thank you. So I made a little bit of an error earlier in the evening and didn't wrap up our panel questions as soon as I should have, and it's now 5 to 9. I have 5 people in the question queue, and we have some closing remarks from the Planning Commission, and I was supposed to give you guys some closing remarks, so I just want to do a quick process check with our hosts. But what shall I do? Keep going with the questions? All right, okay, good. In the back of the rooms. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name's Teresa. I would love to build on what's being talked about in terms of housing, but I'll leave that because I have a couple other comments to make. One is, I think a milestone for 2017 is the process of the Arbutus walkway, the Greenway, and the change from the CPR rail to a public amenity. So I really want to congratulate that milestone. Another milestone I think that we need to be aware of is what's happening with the pipeline and the environment, and how Kinder Morgan and the Trans-Canada Mountain Pipeline are going through, and those are things that, unless we're careful, this will be a very significant milestone happening right now. Another milestone that I'd like to comment on, and I really appreciate Ouri bringing up the fentanyl crisis. This, as I was sitting here, we were talking very much about middle-class milestones, but this is a milestone that is happening right now. And unless we change it, it's going to be a bigger milestone next year and the next year and the next year. So hopefully it can be a milestone now that this is the most deaths we had in 2017, and it does not continue. One of the ways I think that can happen is if we look closer at the milestone that happened with Coast Mental Health in the past couple of years. To me personally, I think that they changed direction backwards rather than forwards. We were finally getting to a point where people were understanding that integration of the mental health community into society was a positive move, and instead the changes that happened with Coast Mental Health turned it backwards and looked at everything from a clinical model. I think that's going to be a very important milestone when we look into the past as to what we did towards mental health and our health of our citizens in the neighborhood, and I think it's a big influence on what's happening in the drug crisis and the deaths in the downtown east side and in Vancouver. Thank you. One last comment. I live in a co-op, and when we put fines on behavior that we don't like, we end up relying on that as a tax because it's behavior we don't like, but we get revenue. It's very dangerous to think you're going to tax behavior on something you don't like, because then you start relying on that revenue.
Okay, kind of like library fines. Yes, yeah, let's move on. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I have a question in the back here, this young lady standing.
Yeah, I'd just like to start off with thanks everybody coming. It's a little frustrating for me to sit here and watch this because you know, I can speak from experience that I worked in Ottawa. I was the acting deputy treasurer at Canada Mortgage in the 90s, the late 90s, and I worked on Bay Street raising money for a lot of developers, and I worked for a developer, and the issues that we have at hand now, and the question is going to come to Gordon and I think Paul, is that without legislation we are going nowhere, okay? That's the rule number one. And the reflection of interest rates, well, I worked on interest rates. It's a reflection of where we are right now. They're too low. And we don't have the political will at the current time to address the situation that we're in. So I'm going to ask, I've got to get the names for Gordon. So in the city, and as the old saying is that, if we don't have an understanding of history, we tend to repeat our mistakes. So do you think that, given where we've come and where we are, that we've repeated some of the mistakes from the past at council? And at the federal level, and I'm going to speak very clearly here, that we cannot do a thing about this crisis if it's not the federal government, because the federal government has been raining this problem down upon us by interest rates, quantitative easing, and we got ourselves in this situation for a lot of reasons. But at the civic level, we're limited. But Gordon, what would you say has happened over the years at the federal level that have been things that worked and that could work now?
Yeah. Do you want to get all?
Yeah, we just have two more, and then we're wrapped up. So go ahead.
Oh, you want to do it right now?
Yeah, go ahead, answer. Yeah.
Oh, well, I confidently say from the local level of government, give us more money. Give us lots of money without a lot of obligations to report back. We know how to spend it. Ian was there telling you how we did back in the 70s. Yeah, give us more money. Particularly if we can lever the land. Always comes back to the land in Vancouver. So if the city has the land and the feds have the money, under a program, certainly legislation and a program fund, we have no problem spending that. And I think our rate of return is pretty good. Pretty good. So I have a feeling I'm not answering your question, but I don't know what it is.
Okay.
Well, the real question is, how would you determine the political will? Because this crisis, and this is a crisis, and one of the things that happened today is fundamental.
Oh, well, tell you what, I can go right to that. Let's see who gets elected in November.
Yeah, so what happened today was we had a 1,245 point drop in the Dow. Okay, why is that? Because suddenly interest rates are back on the horizon. Okay, and interest rates will always identify and address a housing situation. But we do not have the political will at the civic level, at the provincial level, and the federal level. Whereas in the 90s and in the 80s, and you go back to Habitat, you go walk it back, there was a will to address housing. And immigration system is different. But at the civic level, I think that your generation spoke more to the federal government than our current civic leaders. That everyone's kicking the can down the road. Yes or no?
Don't think that's changed. May I say it's not a matter of political will, it is imperatively a political mandate. When you ran, and what you ran on, is that what got you elected? All right, if it did, you've got a mandate. But otherwise, I, as an elected official, I'm going to impose what I believe is right on the community. How do you feel about that? How far is that going to go? Will I be successful? Less so. And we can see already from the civic by-election, there is now proposals out there being treated seriously that simply wouldn't have been spoken a few years ago. Variable property tax, the idea of rezoning the city as a whole, looking for the missing middle. The options that are coming forward now, and I expect will only be even more powerful, more clear in the upcoming election. This is the one to watch for. And if a council goes in and has that mandate from the people of the city through the democratic process, then that's the political will that you need.
Okay, thank you. We have a question right here.
I'm collecting those.
Bob Burnley. I guess my question goes to resources, because I see something that's over top of a lot of the issues you're talking about, and that's the financial resources and the regulatory resources to do what you need. And I'm wondering how we get that. And of course, that's really probably one of the hardest questions. But I want to give a little background on some of these things. First of all, you look at money. The cities and the municipalities take a small fraction of the amount of money that's spent by government. The only source of income you've got in most communities is property tax. If you look at other places, like if you look in Europe, there are places where municipalities, local governments get a portion of the property of the income tax.
Don't hold your breath.
I know. But the thing is, I think it's all about resources and regulatory resources too. And of course, all local governments are creatures of the provincial government. Give you an example of one thing that could have been solved years ago, 15, 20 years ago. 4 pillars drug strategy was there. I think if we'd adopted many of those things, we probably wouldn't be in the position we are now. But where was the problem? The problem was at the federal government, and the problem was at the provincial government. If you'd left it up to the local politicians and the local citizens, we would have solved that one.
Yeah, we're fabulous. So, you a homeowner?
Yep.
Yep. Did you get in early? Decades ago?
Somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, okay. So you've ridden the curve up.
Yeah.
You're a millionaire. Aren't you? And you're not going to be taxed for that, are you? Is that right? Is that right? Do you think the city then has a possibility of increasing your property taxes? I mean, you have made out like a bandit, dude. And if you want, you can defer them. You can take it out of the price of the property when it's sold. Real easy. And hey, what's your justification for you being, what did you do to earn that? You bought a piece of property in Vancouver. Lucky guy. I'm talking about myself. It's obscene. But can you go in there, you want to run for office on this? Saying, hey, we've got this outstanding generational issue that we have to face, and we need the resources, and the equity, the asset value is obscene. Let's take just, I don't know, a small percentage of it.
I mean, if you're asking me if we should be paying more in property taxes, I'm going to do something unpopular. I'm going to say I agree with you.
All right. Well, there's a start.
Here.
Can I add 2 thoughts just on that?
Yeah.
I don't understand actually why a politician in this city wouldn't say that's a good strategy. The majority of people in this city are renters.
Okay.
Exactly. And that's the rub, though, which is why groups like Gen Squeeze need to get better at organizing a demographic, which is disproportionately renters, to be able to figure out how to wield that influence on the Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have one last question up in the front here. This gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Himi, and I'd like to return right to the beginning of the conversation, which is milestones. And is there a missing milestone? Cities in the United States in the 60s, so we have the lens of the future that you talked about, because we don't know what milestones are actually important until we actually get to the future. If we looked at Philadelphia, Detroit, there was something called white flight. Is there a kind of a flight that's happening in Vancouver? If I think of the Punjabi village, businesses are going to Surrey. If I think of the Chinatown night market, it's now moved from Pender to by the airport. If we talk about Aboriginal indigenous people, I can just off the top of my head think of the Balmoral closing down, and then people being relocated, rightfully so, to other housing, but not exactly near the amenities that they need because they were in the downtown east side. If we talk about white flight, I'm thinking of Vancouverism, and instead of redlining a district, saying you're black or you're white and you don't get a mortgage on this side of the street, like in Philadelphia or other US cities, you aren't able to afford a unit above the podium in that tower. So is there, I'm just making an argument, is there a missing milestone, which is the flight? And just Gordon, at the Heritage Vancouver event a little bit over a year ago, you had actually said, don't come, just stop coming. And that was something.
Facetiously. The answer to your question, nope, bad metaphor. It's not white flight. No, do people move within? Yeah, absolutely, that's organic. That's the nature of human settlement. But to take Punjabi village, those are people who are making a new life in a better place. That would be for them anyway. That's their choice. They have a choice. White flight, not analogous.
Take out the word white, just flight in general.
I would say no, it's not analogous. The poisonous legacy of slavery and segregation in the United States produced that dynamic in the 60s. And I'm not going to argue that we have a clean, moral basis from which to argue here, but we did not experience that. The middle class did not flee, and indeed, many of the experiences we had in parallel to the decline of the viability of cities in America was the period, I think, of Canada's greatest optimism. So we were doing amazing things in the 70s here in Vancouver.
Well, Hogan's Alley and the displacement of African Canadian location.
Yeah, as I say, we don't have a clean slate here. But on the scale, and I think analogously, no, I wouldn't compare them.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to...